Well, good morning, everybody. So nice to see you all here virtually. I'm Philip Steenkamp, President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University, and I will be your host today. And it is my huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Jay Dolmage, today's presenter, who I will be introducing shortly. I'd also like, of course, to share my thanks with Associate Director of Human Rights and Accessibility, Alejandro Campos Garcia, who is the director of the Human Rights and Accessibility Office, and also to the School of Humanitarian Studies Assistant Professor Alifia Batalova, who organized today's session. So thank you so much to both of you. And welcome, of course, to everybody who is joining us today. I see we have over 50 participants and climbing, so that is quite wonderful. As we always do, we begin with an acknowledgement. So I want to begin with the acknowledgement that I am joining you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And acknowledgements are very important to Indigenous nations, to First Nations across this country. And we at Royal Roads take these acknowledgements very seriously. It's not just a performative act for us, but we are actively supporting, as many of you might know, the Songhees and the Esquimalt in their efforts to repatriate the lands on which our campus is situated. So it is with deep gratitude we work, live, and learn on these lands each and every day. So maybe just a few housekeeping items and then we'll get started. Your microphones, as usual, have been muted today, but you can ask questions either by unmuting yourself during the Q&A or by using the chat. And our moderator will also read out those questions during the Q&A toward the end of the talk. Obviously, feel free to have your camera on or off, whichever you prefer. But I would say it's always nice to see a few friendly faces as we connect virtually. And a note to everyone that today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. Now, this week is a really important week. It's National Accessibility Week, a time to celebrate the many important contributions of persons with disabilities in Canada. And it's also time to reflect on what we as individuals, as organizations, and of course, as a country can do to increase inclusion. And in alignment with the Accessible BC Act, Royal Roads established its inaugural Accessibility Committee in 2023. And that committee has developed an accessibility plan to help identify and address accessibility barriers across our university. And while these actions aim to build spaces that support the diverse abilities of our community members, we know that this plan is just the beginning of this really important and ongoing work. And so today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jay Dolmage with us to speak about what universities like Royal Roads can do to continue to build more accessible campuses and classroom spaces. Dr. Dolmage is chair of the English department at the University of Waterloo and the founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. His research focuses on the connected rhetorical constructions of disability and race through eugenic and anti-immigration discourse. He has a specific interest in historical and contemporary rhetorical geographies of immigration and eugenics, and in the artifacts and technologies that have been used to rhetorically construct so-called deviant bodies. In today's presentation, Dr. Dolmage will speak about academic ableism, or the way people with disabilities are disadvantaged and excluded in educational settings, and alternatives to this form of discrimination. In his presentation, he asks the question, how can we build more accessible classrooms and campuses beyond the accommodations model? Dr. Dolmage, we are so grateful to have you here to speak with us today. And I'm now going to turn it over to you for a self-introduction and also for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. It's afternoon for me, And no, but it's wonderful to see everybody here. And I'll just sort of say my talk is going to be divided kind of into three parts. I'm going to look at some of the historical ways that disability has been constructed through universities, right? Universities have had a role in defining for us what disability is. I'm also going to look at some of the ways that we've addressed inequities in higher education related to disability, and where that's left us, and in some ways that the results have not been good, right? And then in a true like Three Little Pigs or a Goldilocks and the Three Bears type scenario, I'm going to end with some positives, right? Some solutions, and I hope that that segues nicely into an opportunity for us to ask questions and share ideas together, and leave the space today, you know, ready to change some things, right? As soon as today or tomorrow. That's kind of the goal of why I'm here. So I'm going to share my screen, um, and I'll get right into it. Okay, so I think that academic ableism and the idea of ableism, right? We can define ableism itself, and I think it is important to define the terms that we're using, because a word like ableism can be an intimidating term, right? But ableism is the idea that um, we value perfection, right? We have a culture and a very ableist culture, in fact, in which we're seen to be, we feel a push to make ourselves better all the time, and that is cognitively, physically, right, socially, and this is especially powerful on university and college campuses, right? Because this is very much the ethic of improvement. The problem is that we're not given realistic examples of what it is to be in a body, right? Of what it is to be a learner, right? Of what it is to be existing in social space. We don't have a kind of version of what normal is there. What we have are ideals, right? And this leads then to, to what we call disableism, which is the idea that weakness, right, that failure, that these things are not desirable, right? And that disability itself is something that should be avoided, despite the fact that we will all become disabled at some point in our lives, and we very likely already connect with and care for disabled people or have experienced disability in an intimate way ourselves, right? Disability is the reality, but we have a culture that asks us to push it away as much as we can. And that the outcome of that on a college or university campus is that not just through admissions, right? We have a kind of machine that has very effectively excluded disabled people. And that means that they don't have the same access to power and knowledge, conversation, right? Upward mobility, employment, all of these other things, shaping the research agenda of the future of our country and handling the biggest problems we have to handle. Disabled people are being left out. So I'll give you some of the data on that, right? In 2022, 27% of Canadians aged 15 or older had one or more disabilities. And that was an increase since 2017. That has gone up by 5%, right? 24% of first-year university students in Canada self-declare as having a disability. In this most recent research, that's most commonly related to mental health, and that is a change from previous cohorts. But that 24% is really in stark contrast to the only 6 to 9% of students who seek help through what we call the accommodations process. They get a diagnosis, they jump through all of the hoops, and they get help through our offices of disability services. So that's only a quarter then of the total number of students with disabilities are actually disclosing on our campuses, right? The National College Health Assessment, a giant instrument that looks all across the country, all across North America, it identified two particular things about this cohort of students who are in our classes right now. The first is that they experience higher education itself as disabling, more so than previous cohorts. And I think that language is really interesting and important, right? Because disability is not just a reality, right? It's a constructed reality. The barriers that are in place, the built environment, attitudes, all of those things impact the experience of being disabled. And we're hearing from students that higher education is increasing their feeling of disablement, right? And their reality. The second piece then about this cohort, and it's a bad combination with that first characteristic. The second characteristic is we have a cohort of students who are seeking help less, right? So I think we have what I would call a crisis of help seeking around disability and in many other ways on our campuses. Right? I'll give you an example. 94% of students with learning disabilities in high school have an IEP. They have an education plan. They get some accommodations in their learning. Only 17% of those same students seek accommodations when they get to college or university. Right? So the very types of supports that might have helped them to get to the stage where they could attend a college or university, those are not things they feel they want to seek and get when they get to campus, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with those attitudes out that attitude of ableism. I'm going to work harder when I get there. I'm going to be more independent, right? I don't want to start off on my back foot or feel that I'm getting a special advantage, right? All of those kinds of attitudes, which are ableist attitudes, stop students from seeking those resources that helped them before, right? I'd say right now in Canada, we have tens of thousands of students who are not going to seek help, right? They may graduate, they may struggle, we'll never know, right? Because they'll never disclose their disabilities, right? Students who do eventually register with disability services, they wait an average of 2.4 semesters. So of the small number who do, they're waiting, right? And they're doing so potentially due to stigma, a desire for independence, or maybe a lack of knowledge and understanding about disability, right? There's a bit of a loop that happens here, right? The fewer people who disclose, the less we see disability as part of the fabric on our campuses, the less we as a culture and a society really understand disability, right? Because universities are in part responsible for helping us understand things, right? Okay, so in the United States, studies show that 2/3 of college students don't receive accommodations simply because their colleges will never know about their disabilities. And according to the Canadian Campus Wellbeing Service survey at my own university, University of Waterloo, we know that 75% of Waterloo students indicated that they will not seek accommodations for an identified disability or ongoing medical condition, right? So that's the data, right? And it's tough. We have on many campuses what we might identify as mental health crisis, right? We have a real push for mental health supports and services, right? We know that a larger proportion of disabilities are mental health related, right? And that stigma is stopping students from seeking help, right? And the output then is that 27% of Canadians have university degrees, but only 17% of Canadians with disabilities have degrees, right? Using a 6-year graduation metric, only 49.5% of students completed their university degrees, right? A very modest estimate tells us that somewhere between 10 and 30% of people with disabilities will leave university before obtaining their desired credentials, right? So the lack of disclosure, the lack of help seeking, all of those things are also leading to a lack of graduation, right? A lack of success. The easy thing to do here is to blame the students, right? But I think it's time for us to say we need to structure help differently, perhaps, right? We need to address some of the stigma around disability, and we need to seek to make some changes in the structures, right, that make disability a different experience on campus than it is in other parts of our society, right? We know, again, another outcome, students with disabilities, disabled students are likely to have up to 60% more student debt by the time they graduate, right? Whatever the numbers are, whatever the statistics tell us, right? We know that they speak only for this small. Sorry, let me rephrase that. You'll find a story in the Globe and Mail or the Vancouver Sun, right, or the Toronto Star every couple of years saying there are more disabled students than there ever were before. There are new disabilities, right? And students are being overly diagnosed, right? But the data I'm sharing with you today shows us, right, that even if students are diagnosed, they're not taking those diagnoses to school with them. They're not seeking the help that's available for them, right? And even when and those Office of Disability Services are working hard, right? But we're losing a lot of students. The other thing I want to say is, in the history of higher education, disabled people have been leaders, right? Disabled scientists, for example, are responsible for discovering at least 22 elements of the periodic table, right? Um, I don't want to make it seem like disabled people who we work with today are not also thriving, right? But they're doing so despite the fact that there are a lot of barriers to their inclusion, a lot of barriers to their success, right? And if we want more disabled people involved in big problems and answering big problems and questions for us, designing the future of our country, then we need to make some changes, right? A metaphor that I've always used then to talk about the ways that disabled people are excluded is the steep steps. Okay, and I've got an image here from the movie Monsters University. I'm not sure how many people have seen the movie Monsters University. It's a Disney Pixar movie. Okay, they went and studied campuses like the University of Toronto, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. They found the most traditional possible setting, to an animated setting as a backdrop for this film, right? And in the image you're seeing here, this is the School of Scaring at Monsters University. And it's this kind of neoclassical, neo-Gothic architecture, a big rounded dome, metal dome on top of this building, lots of marble stairs that lead up to this very forbidding dark wood door, right? And the interesting thing for me is that the bodies in the film, the students, are the most diverse possible bodies you could have, right? They're monsters. They're all kinds of different monsters. In this next slide, this is a slug type of monster. And in the very beginning of the movie, as the opening credits are rolling, the bell tower in the background of this image is chiming and everybody's rushing to get to class, right? And as the opening credit roll, we see the slug. He's trying very, very hard to get to class, but not making much progress. The end of the movie, we come back. This is when we see the slug again. The slug is still struggling to get to class and is not going to get there, right? And to me, that's a kind of metaphor for the ways that we have this very traditional architecture, right? And then when we're faced with diversity, we're okay with the idea that some bodies simply are misfit for this traditional architecture. Interestingly, and this movie probably, I think I would say, is the most popular depiction of higher education that we have in our culture, seen mainly by people who don't see themselves as university students yet because they're children, right? But are formulating their understanding of what university is. This movie has a happy ending, and I'm sorry, this is a spoiler, but the happy ending of the movie is that the main characters, the main monsters in the movie, drop out. I think that should worry us, right? That this is one of the dominant images or representations we have of higher education, and the monsters are forced to do so many arbitrary things, right? Jump through so many different hoops that are disconnected from who they want to be and where they want to be in their lives and in their work, that they decide to drop out, right? So that kind of does a good job for me of encapsulating that idea of the steep steps. That university is a place where we actually sort society, we step society, right? And some bodies and minds are made for this, and some are not. At the University of Toronto every year, they do what's called the Great Barrier Hunt, and they go all over campus and they find all the steep steps, right? They find all the inaccessible spaces. And you could think about that in your own movement through your own campus or wherever you've studied in the past, right? So many of the key architectural and aesthetic touch points of campus life are inaccessible, right? And are sending a message to some bodies that they're not part of that lore, right? Part of that tradition, right? And part of that movement upwards through society, right? Okay, so I think the other thing to say is that universities have in general worked to construct disabled people as objects of study, not as researchers, not as teachers or instructors, right? And disability itself is all over the campus, all over the curriculum, all over research, but most of the time it's seen as a problem, right? It's seen as something to be cured or therapeutically intervened in or eradicated, not as a culture or an identity. And I think that's the kind of medical model, and that's something that we've inherited, right? It's something we work hard to reframe, but it's very much part of our inheritance. Okay, so that's the steep steps. The next metaphor that I always use is of the retrofit, because wherever we have a building that has big steep steps in the front, there is an accessible entrance, right? BC has laws, an accessibility act that dictate that buildings must be accessible. There are architectural codes that mandate this, but the problem is most often there's a message sent by that accessibility as well. And it often is, if you're disabled, you come around the back, right? The building that I work in here at the University of Waterloo does have an elevator, but that elevator is also a freight elevator. And it's as far away from the teaching and learning space as possible. And it's a place where the garbage comes in and out, right? And the shipments come in and out. So there's a message that's sent there, right? We have these beautiful staircases right in the middle, and then we have an elevator at the back, which makes the building, accessible, but it sends a message about those bodies who have to access those features, right? The image I'm showing here is from the University of Hull in the UK, and this is a student named Sarah Marie da Silva. In this slide, I mean, we can recognize classrooms like this. It's an amphitheater style classroom, so students enter at the highest point at the back of the room, right? And then you go down a set of stairs and you filter into the desks or the tables that are laid out as you go down the stairs towards the front of the room. So a room like this, to begin with, it doesn't assume that the teacher at the front of the room might be disabled, right? And has very little space for somebody like Sarah Marie who's in a manual wheelchair. In this image, she's sitting in this kind of tiny little vestibule at the back of the room where the door has space to open and close, and she looks pretty ticked off, right? She's got her arms folded. Everybody else gets to sit with their peers. They've got their laptops open and their coffee, and they're taking in this zoology lecture, and she's stuck at the back. But I use this image and I want to point it out because, and you all in BC have things like these audits, right, that give a kind of score for accessibility, right? I think Rick Hansen has been involved in that, if I'm remembering correctly, right? But at the University of Hull, they have this thing called an access map. And it's supposed to highlight all the accessibility features on campus. And this classroom is highlighted as an accessible classroom. If you look at the image, you can guess why. There is an electronic push button door on that door beside Sarah Marie, right? So, and you can think of what the entailments are there, right? It's good to have a push button door. It means if it's a heavy door, right, it opens up automatically. But Sarah Marie, if somebody else came and pressed that button while Sarah Marie is sitting in the only spot in the room she can sit, that door is going to open and hit her wheelchair, right? Which means she'd have to wait every class for the very last moment to go and sit in that spot. It means there could never be two students in wheelchairs in the same class or with mobility aids in the same class. And any student who comes in late, there's a hazard there that Sarah Marie's going to get kind of squished by that door opening. And this speaks to me to this idea that we've had that comes from a good place that says, okay, we've inherited these beautiful old buildings, this inaccessible landscape, right? What can we do to try to fix it? The problem is that so many of those fixes are really minimal, right? And we haven't really carefully thought out from the perspective of the disabled people who are experiencing our campuses. We haven't thought out how those pieces will fit together, right? So we get situations like this where we might be bragging about and spending $10,000 on an accessibility feature that actually is not helping in the classroom, right? So I think the other thing I want to say is I'm talking about this as a metaphor I'm giving you about architecture, about physical space. But the same thing happens. The same kind of steep steps are there in the curriculum, in our teaching and teaching styles, right? In campus life, in other aspects that aren't about the physical and built environment. Similarly, on our syllabus, that statement that's tacked on to the very end that says if you have need of an accommodation, you go elsewhere, you go get that accommodation, you come back to the classroom. That's a classic retrofit, right? It's designed to help students, but it also, intentionally or not, means we don't change the rest of the syllabus. The individual student has to go elsewhere. They have to get a change that's specific to them, and then the rest of the class doesn't change, right? obviously, okay, given what the data that I've already shared, if the vast majority of students are not going to that office, they're not going to disclose their disability, right? We can't continue to progress with this model of a retrofit. We know that there are going to be a lot of students who are not going to go and seek those individual accommodations, right? So the question then becomes, how can we make changes that are going to help all students at the same time as they help disabled students who may not be willing to disclose their disabilities because of stigma or other reasons, okay? So I guess the other thing I want to say that intersects really powerfully with that, crisis around help or seeking help is that we know that disability intersects with other forms of discrimination, right? And other forms of difference. We know that in Ontario, for example, Black and Indigenous students in K to 12, especially male students in grades K to 12, they're disproportionately placed into categories of what are called special education. So they're given disability labels in K to 12, and those labels mean they're much, much less likely to go to college or university. They're in fact streamed out of the kinds of choices that they might be able to make that would lead them to college or university. So if we know that's true, then we have to know that disabled Black and Indigenous students on our campuses are not going to interface with help and with diagnosis the same way that white students might, right? We have a landscape in Canada now where being an international student is very different, right? And international students are looped into immigration and naturalization processes that are changing and that have become medicalized in very different ways, right? So it's not going to be the same for international students. We can't act like the help that we have right now is going to work for that large and important group of students on our campuses, right? The final piece then is that none of us, I'm not sure, I guess I shouldn't assume in Victoria it's the same as it is most other places, but I can't get an appointment with my family doctor. I can't get in to see a specialist within 4, 5, 6 months, right? We have an extremely taxed healthcare system. And yet we have a system where we're saying to students, even if you had a diagnosis in grade 12, you have to get a new one now, right? Or at a point of crisis, we know students are waiting 2.5, 3 years to seek help. At that point, right, we can't assume that it's going to be easy for them to go and get the diagnoses that we're requiring, right, for them to have this kind of formal access to help. And I guess, we can stack all this up together. And
Got it.
I think the important thing is we have to change how we're approaching it. And there are ways to change how we're approaching disability that don't individualize it, right? But that help us to understand that changes that we make for disabled students are also likely to help a variety of other students who aren't necessarily going to seek help through these traditional channels. Okay, and not to belabor it, but the unfortunate truth is when students do go through all those channels to seek help, the help that they get is unfortunately relatively limited, right? More than 3/4 of the accommodations that are offered to students are the exact same thing, and that's just extended time on tests and exams, right? University of Victoria, just as one example, in the last year, they offered 18,000 accommodated exams written through their test center, right? There's a giant industry on our campuses that is just designed to offer extended time on tests and exams, right? That culture already, we know the attitudes and the stress and things that students have around exams. There's a lot of anxiety around fairness and cheating in that stress, right? And unfortunately then disability gets understood in this kind of matrix of assessment and fairness and potential cheating and competition, right? And none of that is healthy. And it really hurts, I think, that the rate of disclosure for disability. Because there's a kernel of an idea that if you seek an accommodation, you're getting something unfair, right? Unfortunately, if you go on Google Scholar and you search for disability plus higher education, you're going to get thousands of hits that are about testing. Very, very few hits that are about other forms of teaching and learning, right? And as teachers and instructors, we're not just testers and assessors, right? We do so much more. On the Royal Roads University homepage, right, when you land there and you go and see the pictures that are there, students are involved in the most exciting forms of learning, experiential learning, right? They're in high-tech labs, they're in practical situations, right? They're doing entrepreneurship, they're working in the community, all of these things that are really exciting and important. There's no pictures of students in the testing center. There's no pictures of students in a gym taking an exam, right? So it's tough for me to see that disability is getting understood through this form of learning that's from the 40s or 50s, this kind of factory model of education. And the future of education is what is available to everybody else. Okay, so the other thing I'll say is, nobody walks into an engineering firm and says, put your pencils down, whatever bridge you designed is the one that you're going to build, right? Testing is an outdated mode, right? And so it's really tough for me to see the amount of resources that get put in just to adjusting this older mode of teaching and learning, right? And at the same time, we're not doing a very good job of helping students learn about the accommodations that they might need in their future in the world of work, right, where there isn't a lot of high stakes testing. But there are other kinds of accommodations that students could really need and might be really helpful to them. At the University of Waterloo, it's a big co-op school, so our students go and they work and get paid to be in a workplace, and then they come back and learn. And what they experience usually is that they have much better accommodations in the workplace than they had in the university, right? And that's a mismatch I think we should be paying attention to. Okay, so talked about the history of higher ed, talked about the retrofitting we've done to try to make adjustments, which we still have to do, right? It's really important. We need to keep working with disability services. We need to see every student's accommodation as an opportunity to change what we do in the classroom and to help them, right? But I promise better solutions than that, right? And I want to get there. What I wish there was more research on is what accommodations might actually help students. And there's very little of that research out there. One of the only studies that's been done was done at the University of Illinois, right? And this was in a school of engineering. 303 students were surveyed from 49 different courses. And here are the things they were asking for, okay? They wanted recorded lectures as videos. They wanted transcripts for lectures, course notes, right? They wanted access to the instructor, but also access to the materials in a course outside of the 50 minutes or 80 minutes of a class, what we now call asynchronous learning, right? So that in the classroom they could pay attention and that later they could go back and repetitively, have access to material, right? So the interesting thing to me is that during the pandemic, very quickly, we had to learn how to offer a lot of those things as instructors. We had to pivot. We were telling students, for example, we were telling students with disabilities that our participation and attendance policies were inflexible. You have to be here. The only way to learn is to be here in person. And then all of a sudden we said, nope, nobody's allowed to be here in person. And the education that we're offering is still going to be really, really good. So we had to teach ourselves a lot of things really quickly. To me, a lot of those things were things that people with disabilities were asking for and were told were impossible for a very long time. It's also proof and evidence that we can make changes. And in higher education, you all know we get constructed by the popular media as this radical places, but we're really conservative. We do a lot of the same things year after year after year, right? It's important to know that we have that potential for change and that we can make changes and keep them, right, even out of something like a pandemic, and that those things are gonna help students, right? Okay, so we do know that there are accommodations that can help students. I could talk, for example, about the ways that I've expanded what I think of as participation in my classrooms, right? We could talk about the ways that we can flip this high stakes timed testing model, right? To de-emphasize some of the stress, right, that goes around that, right, and emphasize more of the learning. I'll say, in Ontario, for example, there are fewer and fewer tests and exams in K-12 education. We're not that far away from a model where we're going to have many students coming into university who have not had high stakes tests and exams. Even things like the LSAT are moving away from that high stakes exam format, right? So we should begin talking about what some of the alternatives to that might be, right? What are some of the ways that we can make course materials available to people outside of the 50 minutes or 80 minutes of class, right? So that it's not a race in that time to record and absorb information, but that students might be more actively engaged in the class. And I have examples of how I do that, in part by, in my model, sharing the responsibility for creating access. That students have shared note taking, right? That students who have to miss a class can be filled in by other students who are there, right? And that be valued and rewarded as a valuable part of the class, right? Okay, so the other thing then, and this is my third metaphor, right? But we talked about the steep steps, the buildings that are inaccessible, and the part of their beauty and aesthetic is that they're forbidding, right? And then we have entrances around the back through the kitchen or through the freight entrance or whatever that make the buildings measure up to kind of the law, but in a minimal kind of way. The third metaphor then is universal design. And the image I'm showing you here is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. If you haven't been there, I really highly recommend that you go there. It's free on Sundays. But the architect and the builders began with this idea of how can we create a building like this with no stairs, right? How can we make sure that everybody's pathway through this building is equal, right? How could we take something like a ramp, which we often see as an add-on, and how can we make that the central aesthetic element of this space, right? And it matters because of the mission of the university around human rights, right? But it also should matter for any public building that we're putting a lot of resources in, because it can be just as beautiful. It can be just as functional, right? And I think this museum is kind of evidence of how that can work, right? So if you see this image, it's a level entranceway that kind of, you can see people are walking in and out of the building along this kind of like curved ramp that leads into the building. On the outside, the cladding of this building are these big alabaster kind of swooping curves, right? And when you get into the building, those same curves are mirrored by the ramps that kind of crisscross the space. I will say it's a little bit of a difficult building to be in if you're afraid of heights like I am, because the ramps keep taking you up higher and higher as you kind of circulate through the different exhibits. And it does get pretty high, high near the top. I found myself staying away from the railings, right? But interestingly, that the space, it's very hard to find stairs. There are no stairs in the space, right? And that's this idea of universal design. And what's behind the idea, it first came out of the disability rights movement, but it's the idea that we should be able to build beautiful buildings, functional buildings, from the very beginning for all bodies, right? There's no special route for some bodies, but that everybody should be able to access the space in the same way, right? And that's led into universal design of a variety of things, right? Truly, I'm holding up my phone right now, but almost everything that's really cool that your phone does was originally a niche and expensive technology that was only for disabled people. And I'm really serious about that, like email itself, optical character recognition, speech to text, text to speech, all GPS, all of these things were originally actually designed only for disabled people, and they were expensive and hard to get for disabled people, until we realized that we could build apps, that we could build functions, that we could do all of these different things for everybody by entering through this special technology only for a special group. That's part of the philosophy of universal design, is if you design for and through disabled people, what you get will be better for everybody. Okay, that's led into what we call universal design for learning, right? This way of building our classrooms and our curriculum, not with disability as the thing that's mentioned at the end of the syllabus, right? But as this thing that shapes the experience for all students for the better. The three main principles of universal design are multiple means of representation, what I call positive redundancy, right? Making sure that students can access the information in our classes in a variety of flexible ways. Technology makes that so easy now, right? But we don't want to be testing students, right, ability to quickly take notes, for example, right? What we want to make sure is that students can access that information when they need to. An example I always give of that is I built a big online course at Waterloo, and we had videos of me speaking, right? We created transcripts for those videos. The truth is, students don't watch the videos. They read the transcripts, and you can see that in an online course. That was a feature that was designed for accessibility, but we soon realized that's just a better feature for all students. The problem is, most videos on most university learning pages don't have transcripts at all, right? So that is not something that's being harnessed, even though it's something that can help all students. Multiple means of expression, then the second piece, that's really important because it gets to the testing issue, right? How can we find flexible ways for students to show us what they know, right? Not really noisy, bad instruments like time tests. Time tests don't make students study more or more effectively. They don't make students retain more information, right? And they don't even give us a really clear picture of how well we've taught the material because they don't really faithfully reveal what students know, right? We'd never run a lab and run that experiment again, right? But like I said, we're doing that over and over and over again in our classrooms, even though it's not giving us the information we need and it's not allowing students to show us what they know. And whoops, sorry, I'm gonna share again because I messed up here. You, here we go, sorry. Okay, so and then the final piece is multiple means of engagement. And to me, that's just like all the cool stuff on the Royal Roads website. All the future of learning, experiential learning, community-based learning, all those things need to be made available for disabled students too. And it won't be hard for us to do that, right? But we can't remain bogged down in this old factory model just for disabled students. We need to begin and making sure and ensuring that they are part of the future. Okay, so this seems like a lot, right? I want to point out that my book, Academic Ableism, it's available in open access. But one of the other things that's available open access as part of this book is that I have a long list of thousands of universal design ideas for teaching. And I just call them places to start. The idea isn't that you overhaul your teaching tomorrow. Part of what I want to encourage is just a kind of experimental attitude. Can you find 2 or 3 other people who teach courses like yours or the same course? And can you say, we're going to change our participation policy in this way, right? We're going to remove one timed test and make it into a different type of instrument of assessment. So one little thing, and I promise you, just like the entailments of disability technology, you're going to find if you make one change to help disabled students, who we know are not necessarily going to be disclosing. You may not know who they are in your classroom, but if you make that change on good faith and feeling as though this is going to help them, that one little change will help more students than just the disabled students in your class, right? So it's just what people call +1 thinking, okay? And then the other thing that I want to say is, like, if we have -1 or if we have +1 thinking, we're going to try one little thing, and I have a long list of little things you could try. Then it's also okay to begin thinking about -1 thinking. How can we take some things out that give us more time to engage with those new teaching techniques, right? Can we take out the grading of one major quiz or exam and use the time that we have, the surplus time that we have, to meet one-on-one with students more, right? Or to develop something that's more accessible. I just think, and I won't soapbox about it too much, but I believe that, like, the credit hour has experienced unbelievable inflation, right? And that we're jamming so much into the 12 weeks of our courses because we believe in all of it, right? But we need sometimes to give ourselves permission to let go of some pieces, right? So that we can teach more effectively with what it is we are doing. So that's my permission, I guess I'm giving you, right? Try adding in some of these new techniques. I promise you, you'll see that it helps. And give yourself permission to, if you're gonna do that, to take some things out, right? I think then that, okay, so I just want to return to the images that we have, right? I want you to think a bit about those images as we end. The first is that image of the slug at Monsters University, right? And the reality that we know there are students who are being left behind, who we're losing, right? And if we keep doing things the way that we are, that will keep happening. In my estimation, I think it's tens of thousands of students in Canada who are going to leave university without having sought help, right? And we're going to lose that potential, right? Then I think we have that image of Sarah Marie kind of ticked off in the back of the classroom. She's going to fight hard to be there, right? To be where she belongs, right? But it's going to be difficult for her, right? And there are going to be barriers that are placed. We're going to sometimes believe that we're doing the very best we can, but we're still putting some students in really difficult positions, right? We're also saying, hey, you're going to go elsewhere to get your needs met, right? And your place in the curriculum is kind of extra to the other students. And then finally, think of that Canadian Human Rights Museum, right? How could your classrooms, your curriculum, even things like student services and resources on campus, how could they be built with access in mind from the very beginning? Okay, thanks for your time today. I hope we can chat a little bit more and that I can answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dolmage, for that exceptional presentation. I think we've got about 14, 15 minutes here for questions. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Alejandro to help us navigate. I'm sure there are going to be many reflections and comments, and people will have questions for you. So just a reminder to write your questions in the chat so a moderator can read them, or raise your virtual hand and unmute yourself when called upon. So Alejandro, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. So please feel free to ask the questions or comments, and yeah.
I see there's a question in the chat here from
Yeah.
Deb. I'll just read it out. She says she really loves this presentation and all of the metaphors and images. Could we get the links in the chat to those resources? I think I can share those if you send them to me after the presentation, Jay.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share the slides. I'm happy to share the talk itself. Please share it as much as you want. And also the other thing I'd say is, like, if I were there right now, we get to have coffee and cookies or something like that. I'm not there, and that's good too for access, but I'll put my email in the chat. Send me an email just as you might come up to me, while we're having coffee. I really do want to engage with people and the specificity of the questions that they might have, even if you don't feel like you can or you want to ask it now, or maybe it comes up for you in 4 or 5 months, right? I do want to help, so I will put that email in the chat.
I confirm that every time I have written Jay, he answers right away, and he answers with a lot of joy. So yeah. So Gemma, please.
Thanks, Alejandro. Well, I'm chiming in just with a little bit of joy. So thank you so much for this, Jay. I work as a counselor and learning strategist at Royal Roads, and so I work closely with accessibility services as well. So, yeah, I think the first thing that struck me was just how many people showed up to this event today, and it just kind of warms my heart because I know there is a lot of people really committed to making higher education more accessible. And I know we have a huge challenge. And I love the fact that you're talking about UDL, because I think that is important. I guess my question would be, if you have any words of wisdom for faculty, associate faculty, who sometimes feel like they're swimming upstream a little bit already.
Yeah.
And then the thought of, having to change the way that we've done things for a while. So I think we're all on board with, yes, this is wonderful, and yet people feel really stretched and thin. I see it as like, I'd love to be out of a job one day. I think accessibility services would love to be out of a job one day. That would be the ideal, and we're a long way from that. But what are some ways we can approach this?
Sure.
And I think you've already pointed to the +1, -1, but any other words of wisdom, please?
Sure. I'm sharing some more of those resources in the chat as well, including my participation policy, a few other things, but I think part of it is like it's so nice to see so many people here, you know, on a Wednesday morning. But I would also guess that this is the group that is at a lot of things, right? And that's terrific, right? Because we're, you know, I go to everything too, right? And I'm constantly learning things, and I'm trying to build little bits at a time into what I'm doing because I am excited about change. But that's not everybody, right? And I think part of our challenge is like, how do we take this and how do we go back into our departments? How do we go back and share this with colleagues so that we get some uptake, sometimes from the folks who would never come to this, right? So the one suggestion that I have, a really tangible suggestion, is we begin treating this seriously in the ways that we talk about it. And that means we need to talk about it in tenure, promotion, performance review, hiring, right? Those are the big places. That's where we get leverage, right? And so it is a lot of work. It is based in research, right? And it has demonstrable outcomes that are good for your program, for your faculty, for your university, right? And so let's take it seriously, right? And let's do that in the ways that we talk about it. Let's formalize it in things like performance review, tenure, promotion, hiring. That's one thing. The other big piece is let's do this with one another, right? So that's where we because it's otherwise I think we end up running out of energy, right? Let's try to pair with other people. Let's create what we do this in my department, a thing called like teaching circles or squares, right? So it's multiple people trying the same thing and then meeting very informally. We usually just have a dinner or a lunch at the end of the term to talk about how it worked for us, right? That to me is much more sustaining than constantly doing things alone. And then the biggest piece for me is be serious about -1, right? I taught in the States for a decade and I had 16-week terms. And I came back to Canada and they were all 12-week terms. And I was like, I can't lose anything, you know? And the truth is, I think we can lose. We can let go of some assessment. That's the thing that I suggest to people that they lose, right? I teach writing classes, used to teach 4 major papers, and grading and responding to each of those papers, each of those things took about 25 hours, right? Well, during the pandemic, I took out one of those papers and I used that 25 hours to make my teaching around the other 3 papers so much better than it was. And it converted the semester from being a race to being a place where there actually was reflection, where I could build in more peer review and collaboration, right? All those things are important because I also know this at Waterloo. That's what employers want to see students can do. They don't want to see more competition amongst students, right? They don't want to see this mismatch in this culture of where grading is the majority of the work that we do and the majority of value students attach to a course. So to me, I think that -1 is again a really big piece. Let's reward one another for doing this. Let's not make it another thing we have to add on top of everything else. Let's make sure we take some things out, right? And let's do it together.
Althea?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Jay, so much for your presentation. My question is around legislation. I think we have so much hope in BC now with Accessible BC Act. And, you know, and looking at the Ontario's example with their accessibility legislation and the criticism that it has gotten over the years for kind of failing disabled people in so many ways. What do you think we lose when we rely solely on, you know, the language of compliance or standards? You know, and do you see a potential for legislation to enact change or not? Is it just inherently, you know, how in disability studies there's a distinction between disability rights and disability justice?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, what is our kind of, way to navigate that? What do you think?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and like an open question. I think I'm trying to pay attention to that. Like January 1st, 2025, we now have a completely accessible Ontario. I'm kidding, right? Like that was we've known for a very long time that was the date everything was going to be in place, and really very little has happened, right? But I think there's something very powerful. So I was just talking with somebody about this. There are 444,000 organizations or businesses in Ontario that are subject to the AODA. It's not necessarily about the idea that the university is subject to disability legislation. That's important. Universities will probably be leaders. We've got very skilled people who can make sure that we comply, right? The much bigger piece is the 400,000 or so organizations and businesses in BC that your students will go and work at, right? What each of those businesses and organizations need and will be hiring for are people who know what the legislation is and know how to get there, right? The missed opportunity on our campuses is not, it's there. We're missing some opportunities to make what we do more accessible, but it's bigger than that. We're missing opportunities to educate people who can become the accessibility experts where they go, right? And we know that's extremely valuable, and it will differentiate students from their peers, and it will get them jobs, and it will keep them jobs, right? So to me, we're a proto public space in a university, right? We're teaching things, but we're also shaping things. And so you should know that when you model accessibility in your classroom, in your teaching materials, and so on, you're modeling a value that's a real one in the real world. There's no job that a student is not going to enter into that won't be impacted by that legislation. So I think that's important, right? And I think it underlines why we should care. But the other piece for me is the verbs matter, right? Like a learning outcome is not comply. Nobody has that in their syllabus, right? So we do need more than that, right? And we don't just want students to stay. We want students to thrive, right? And all of this matters. And to me, that the other distinction, like you said, is we want more than just rights. Disability is an identity. It's a culture, right? Disability should be in our syllabus as part of the curriculum, right? The disability culture should be, right? It shouldn't be on the last page. It should be part of what we do. And so I think that's a big part of the goal, but it's an uphill battle, right? It really is an uphill battle. And I'll keep tracking where we go with this. The university, the truth is, the legislation has spurred people like presidents and provosts and deans to recognize disability in ways that they wouldn't without the legislation, right? But that's just this little starting point, and but I'll take it.
I would like to be minded about the time. Juan, if you can send Jay your question via email, would be lovely. So I pass the baton to Philip again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can imagine we could have continued this discussion for a long time, Jay. So thank you for your very thought-provoking presentation. I take away from it many things, but I love that concept of multiple means in those three different categories. It's a kind of really powerful framing of how you can approach these issues and the benefits that these kinds of changes can have for all students. Actually, it's quite an interesting way to think about it. So thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing from you, and I want to thank Alejandro and Althea as well for the organization. Thank the Raw Roads Communications and Multimedia Services for supporting the event, and thank everybody who joined today too. It was great to have a very good audience for this. And this is an important conversation which we continue to have at our university. And I think Jay's given us a lot to think about. I love the +1, -1 too, because it makes things much more manageable and achievable, and doesn't seem as overwhelming as these things can sometimes seem. So Jay, thank you. And I look forward to further conversations. And thanks, everybody. Great to see you all. Goodbye.